Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Grand Rounds presentation. My name is Will Pigeon. I'm a professor here in the Department of Psychiatry and director of our Sleep Research Lab. Today's presentation is entitled Multidimensional Sleep Health Measurement, Consequences, and Interventions, and will be delivered by Dr. Daniel J. Buysse from the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. Dr. Buysse has the distinction of having been told on Wednesday, March 11th of 2020 that he was the first URMC psychiatry ground speaker to be canceled due to the then new pandemic. So I am very pleased to have him back, or to have him here with us. A few housekeeping items. The mics and cameras are off for all of you, other than the interpreter and our presenter. For questions, please use the Q&A box and not the chat box, the latter being kept open for interpreters and technical issues. At the end of the hour, towards the end of the hour, I'll relay any questions to Dr. Buysse for the Q&A portion. And also at the end of the hour and at the conclusion of the presentation, a couple ways to provide feedback and get CE credit. There'll be a survey link that will be posted in the chat at the end of the presentation. There's a web page with the survey link that will pop up when you leave the rounds. And later there will be an email sent out containing the link the day after. That would be tomorrow, wouldn't it? The presentation. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniel J. Buysse, Professor of Sleep Medicine, Psychiatry, and of Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. Born in the Motor City, Dr. Buysse received both his bachelor's and his MD from the University of Michigan. His internship and residency in psychiatry, as well as subsequent research fellowship and a polysomnography fellowship, was done at the Western Psychiatric Institute. And Dr. Buysse has spent his subsequent career to date in Pittsburgh. Multidimensional is an apt talk title for our speaker. Dr. Buysse is the co-director of the UPMC Sleep Medicine Center. He has leadership roles in the University of Pittsburgh's Clinical and Translational Science Institute. He's the principal investigator of a long-running T32 to train researchers in sleep medicine, and has also received a number of distinguished awards from various societies. But the range is multidimensional: a research award, an educator award, a service award, and a distinguished achievement award. Dr. Buysse is the author and developer of the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, one of the most widely used instruments in sleep measurement, subjective sleep measurement that we have. He's the author of over 400 peer-reviewed articles, has chaired many multiples of committees, work groups, and task forces, has supervised several dozens of psychiatry residents, sleep medicine fellows, and psychology interns, and mentored a virtual who's who list of postdoctoral research fellows and K awardees. Finally, as one of the scores of people myself who reach out to Dan with random questions and requests periodically, and I'm always met with a multi-dimensional, mix of collegiality, generosity, and humor. It is again my great pleasure to now finally cede the floor to our Grand Rounds speaker for today, Dr. Dan Buysse.
Thank you, Will, for that extremely kind introduction. Very much appreciate it, and good to be here with all of you, at least virtually. Yeah, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be there in person over a couple of years ago, but we'll do our best to catch up. As you can see, I've already changed the title a little bit here, but the content is much the same. I have to say that as I was thinking about giving grand rounds in a department of psychiatry, I was wondering, geez, is there enough psychiatry in here? But then I saw the motto on your 75th anniversary logo for the department, which said biopsychosocial innovations. And then I felt better because this is very, very much in the biopsychosocial realm of things and tradition of things. Also want to thank the technical staff for that great lead-in music, Weaver of Dreams by Freddie Hubbard. How appropriate. So thanks again for that. All right. As we get started then, I just wanted to indicate potential conflicts of interest. I do receive licensing fees for several instruments, including ones that will be discussed today. What I'd like to talk about with you is the what and why, kind of why it is that I'm interested in this concept of multidimensional sleep health. We'll talk a little bit about the reliability and validity of measurement of this construct. And I am not by any stretch a statistician, but I would like to show you a couple examples of how interesting statistical techniques can be brought to bear on this topic. We'll then talk about some of the health outcomes related to multidimensional sleep health that include but are not limited to mental health outcomes as well. And finally, we'll wrap up talking about interventions that may target this concept of multidimensional sleep health. My journey into this topic began as many adventures do in the back seat of a cab. This particular cab ride, I happened to be sharing with a guy named Michael Tweary. Michael was the director of the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And as any self-respecting academic would do, if you're sharing a cab ride with a center director, I said, Michael, you have to help us to get more funding for sleep research. I mean, sleep is related to everything. It's related to things like obesity and diabetes and cancer and heart disease, depression, and substance use. And we know that sleep is also related to mortality. And Michael Tweary is the guy who sometimes sees the glass as half empty rather than half full. And he said, Dan, it's great. You guys in the sleep field, like, you want more money for sleep research, but you have to realize that you're in competition with the cardiologists and the pulmonologists. And, the problem with the sleep field is that you guys can't even come up with a consistent definition for what good sleep is, right? Like, the cardiologist can tell you what a good blood pressure is, and the pulmonologist can tell you what good pulmonary function is, but you guys can't even agree on what good sleep is. I have to say that Dr. Tweary's question got me thinking, and I realized that on some level he was right. As a field, we really didn't focus too much on what good sleep is. In fact, we spent most of our time looking at sleep disorders, which is a different thing entirely. So I began to think about how we might construct a framework for understanding how it is that sleep is related to all of these adverse outcomes. What's a way of thinking about these relationships? So the first thing that you might try to tackle when you're developing such a framework is to think about what sleep is good for. Now, on some level, we all understand and know what sleep is. We recognize it when we see it. But what you may not think about so much is that sleep is incredibly evolutionarily conserved. So yeah, mammals sleep and reptiles sleep, and my granddaughter Layla sleeps, and we recognize that. But when you go back in the evolutionary tree, sleep-like states are evident in Drosophila, fruit flies, in C. elegans, a primitive worm, and even in Cassiopeia jellyfish, which don't have a brain, but they have the equivalent of sleep-wake states. So sleep is something that is conserved across evolution and therefore must serve some very important functions. Now, people have spent a lot of time delving into the details of this, but I think on a very broad level, if we ask what sleep is good for, what we recognize is that sleep optimizes our adaptation and function at every level of biological organization. So sleep affects things like energy regulation at the cellular and even molecular level. It affects optimal tissue and circuit functioning in the brain. It affects and optimizes our cognition, affect, learning, and behavior. So all of these things, sleep helps to optimize. In fact, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anything about an organism's function that is not optimized by the presence of regularly occurring sleep-wake states. So when we talk about sleep, though, we have to recognize that there are certain challenges to talking about sleep because it's several things at once. Sleep is a complex neurobehavioral state that has well-recognized neural mechanisms controlling it. It's also a state that unfolds as a temporally ordered process over time, and one that's accompanied and even regulated by typical behaviors. Now, we try to describe all of these things in quantitative terms, but it's no easy task to try to simultaneously keep in mind all of these different aspects of sleep. Furthermore, when we think about good sleep, we can talk about it on several different levels of analysis, from all the way from genes and molecules up to symptoms and self-report. You can actually, again, it's kind of surprising, but you can measure the effects of sleep and the characteristics of sleep at the very smallest, minute levels of organization. Now, today, we're going to be talking mainly about organization, about levels of analysis that are higher up, from electrophysiology to behavior to symptoms and self-reports. Now, again, I was looking for a kind of a construct for explaining how it is that sleep and sleep problems can be related to adverse health outcomes. And one construct, one way of doing that is to think about sleep disorders. So we have several categories of sleep disorders that are well recognized, well described. And we also know that each of these sleep disorders in its own way can contribute to poor health. However, not everyone has a sleep disorder. And so we can think about sleep in more kind of descriptive and normative terms. One way of doing that is to recognize that sleep typically occurs and consumes about a third of our 24-hour day. So sleep here being represented by the blue and wakefulness by the yellow. And we would recognize that sleep patterns can have several characteristics. So for instance, they may be described as being good or poor in quality, may leave us satisfied or unsatisfied. On the other hand, sleep may leave us with a poor sense of satisfaction and quality. Sleep may result in a high level of daytime alertness or a low level of daytime alertness. Sleep can occur at a normal time relative to our biological circadian clock, or it may occur later than normal or earlier than normal. Sleep can occur with high efficiency, that is, as a consolidated block that's interrupted by very little wakefulness, or it may occur with low efficiency disrupted by considerable blocks of wakefulness. Sleep can also have normal duration or short or long duration. And finally, sleep may occur in regular timing and amounts across successive days, or it may be characterized by low regularity in terms of the amount, the timing, or any other dimension of it. So sleep simultaneously has all of these characteristics, all of these multiple dimensions. And while an individual may have good characteristics on one dimension, they may have poor characteristics on another. And furthermore, they may have multiple ways in which their sleep is disrupted. So an individual could simultaneously have poor quality, late timing, poor efficiency, and short duration, just as an example. The reason this is important is that if we're looking at how sleep affects health outcomes, we need to recognize that there's no one single metric for capturing how sleep may be related to those outcomes. In short, it's not all about sleep duration. So thinking about sleep in this way, I proposed the following definition for sleep health as a conceptual framework. That sleep health is a multidimensional pattern of sleep and wakefulness that's adapted to individual, social, and environmental demands, and that promotes physical and mental well-being. So again, I've talked about these different dimensions of sleep, but the important thing to recognize is that, first of all, every individual can be characterized on each of these dimensions at every point in time. And these dimensions are orthogonal to sleep disorders. Furthermore, these dimensions of sleep, when they are more or less favorable, impact our health in positive or negative ways. The acronym that you can use to remember these different dimensions is RU SATED for, again, regularity, satisfaction, alertness, timing, efficiency, and duration. Now, just to give you an illustration of why it is that we need to think about, or that I would recommend that we think about multiple dimensions of sleep, as illustrated by these examples. So let's consider 3 people who each sleep for 5 hours. Person 1 sleeps for 5 hours because they're a night shift worker, and they may have sleep quality that is moderate, but they have unusual sleep timing. They're sleeping during the day. Individual 2 also sleeps for 5 hours, but with poor quality and highly disturbed efficiency that may be characteristic of insomnia. Individual 3 may sleep for 5 hours because that person is working 2 jobs, raising a family, and simply doesn't have enough time to get more sleep. And when they do, their sleep is of high quality and duration. Now, clearly, if you were only looking at sleep duration, you would think that these 3 individuals are equivalent, but clearly the circumstances and other characteristics around their sleep are quite different and may have important ramifications for their health outcomes. Excuse me for 1 second here. Okay. So when we think about sleep from a multidimensional sleep health framework, I think there are several benefits that might accrue from that. First, thinking about sleep routinely in a multidimensional sense can enhance the replicability and rigor of our sleep health research. It can be useful in identifying important correlates and predictors. It may also have a role in health screenings, and it may accelerate and change the direction of mechanistic sleep research if we're not looking for instance, for mechanisms purely associated with short sleep duration, but also with other profiles of multidimensional sleep health. And finally, this framework suggests some novel treatment targets. So that's my overall kind of spiel on why I started to think about multidimensional sleep health. Now I'd like to address the question of whether or not we can actually measure this construct in a reliable and valid way. I had mentioned, of course, that sleep can be considered along several levels of analysis. When we think about measuring multidimensional sleep health, we mainly think about the self-report or experiential dimension, but we can measure multidimensional sleep health using behavioral measures such as actigraphy, or even physiologic measures such as polysomnography. Although we haven't done it yet, one can imagine that you could also measure sleep health with imaging. So different dimensions of imaging may also be useful ways of measuring sleep and its consequences. Now, keep in mind as well that the specific dimensions of multidimensional sleep health may vary with different levels of analyses, so that, for instance, if you're measuring a person's self-report, you may not be measuring exactly the same dimensions as you would with polysomnography. For instance, with polysomnography, you can measure sleep stages, and those are just really not available to a person's experience of sleep. Some examples of the ways that you might measure this. So in the self-report domain, we have an RU SATED questionnaire that I'll talk about, but you can also get a lot of the information from sleep diaries. Actigraphy is useful for measuring all of these dimensions except the satisfaction or quality one, but you can also get rest activity rhythms, which is a novel dimension that can't be measured with self-report. Again, PSG allows you to measure sleep stages and different kinds of EEG characteristics, and sleep studies are also very good for describing that temporal process that I mentioned characterizes sleep. And finally, imaging or brain circuitry, again, can look at connectivity and intrinsic brain networks that may be characteristics of high or low quality sleep. So if we think about a self-report measure of multidimensional sleep health, though, what I think are reasonable goals is to try to assess these multiple dimensions. I set out to try to do it with a single question for each dimension, which is not necessarily easy. I think it can be done. I'm not sure that it's always elegant, but you can do it. I wanted to come up with something that was brief and that was easy to score and interpret. That is, I didn't want people to have to calculate anything in order to get a score, and I wanted to avoid reverse scoring so that someone, even a clinician, might be able to use an instrument very readily. Some of these are lessons learned from the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index that Dr. Pidgeon mentioned, which does require calculations and is not necessarily easy to score on that account. Finally, I thought that it would be ideal if these different dimensions would load on a single underlying factor. Ideally, we would try to characterize aspects of sleep that describe both the state-like qualities of sleep and its process over the night. Technically, though, I would also point out that these characteristics of a multidimensional sleep health measure are not really what we would consider patient-reported outcomes. Because they're based on empirical findings. The dimensions are based on empirical findings about what aspects of sleep are important for health outcomes. It's not based on patient preferences. So I came up with the following questionnaire, which is, I've now started to version it, so this was version 2.0. We have questions, again, one question for each dimension of sleep health. They are all kind of scored in the same direction, and these are the initial response categories that I had with it. This scale would be scored from 0 to 12, 12 indicating good sleep health, 0 indicating poor sleep health, and you just simply add up the totals for each item. So I kind of put this questionnaire out there as sort of a thought experiment, but as is sometimes the case, people took me literally as well as seriously, and before I knew it, people were actually conducting validation studies of this questionnaire. I'm not going to go through these in detail, just to say that there is now a fair amount of psychometric validation of the RU-sated scale. And for the most part, the studies show that there is one factor. Occasionally people identify two factors with this questionnaire, but it generally performs pretty well according to the goals that I initially set out. So what remains to be done in this area? Again, this wasn't really developed as a patient-reported outcome. It was just put out there kind of as a thought experiment. So we're now going back and retracing our steps. We've done cognitive interviews that measure people's understanding of the questions and whether the questions match the intended concept. We have an updated version, which jumps over version 3 to version 4. And our plans are to use this version to do classic test theory validation, all the things that you would do for psychometric validation of a questionnaire. And we'll have known groups validation data as well. So this is currently kind of in process. We also plan to use another type of psychometric validation called item response theory validation, which evaluates the characteristics of each individual item as well as the entire set of questions as part of a questionnaire. So that too is planned for the near future. And we will validate the questionnaire against some other behavioral and objective measures of sleep. So this is what we have planned next. Now, I want to acknowledge as well that we have a particular definition and way of looking at multidimensional sleep health, but it's not the only way of looking at it. And others have also addressed this topic. For instance, the National Sleep Foundation got a group of experts together and they came up with something called the National Sleep Foundation Sleep Health Index. It has 3 subscales for quality, duration, and disordered sleep. So some overlap with what we have proposed. And this paper from Lee and colleagues in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology identified a multidimensional pattern of sleep health that, again, addresses many of the same durations. So chronotype is timing, adequate sleep duration, no frequent insomnia is similar to our dimension of efficiency. Now, snoring is something in the sleep disorders category that we don't have, but daytime sleepiness was part of their construct as well. And this study was interesting because in a sample of over 400,000 people from the UK Biobank, they found that these self-report sleep measures were that good sleep health along these dimensions was associated with lower risk of atrial fibrillation and other cardiac arrhythmias. Finally, our pediatrician colleagues also have addressed sleep health with a slightly different questionnaire. It has many of the same dimensions that I've already talked about, but what it includes as well is a dimension for behavior. That is the pattern of sleep behaviors between parent and child that may establish good or poor sleep patterns. So they have termed their scale in some places as the B-sated scale for pediatric sleep health. All right, so we've talked about the construct of sleep health and how we might measure it with simple self-report questionnaires. I'd like to turn now to the question of how we can start working with this multidimensional construct to examine health outcomes. In order to do that, we need to have some statistical approaches for doing so. So I think the challenges in terms of analyzing data with a multidimensional sleep health framework are that the fact that you have multiple sleep health domains is a blessing and a curse, because it's unlikely that optimal sleep health confers risk or protection as a simple linear combination of dimensions. In other words, we don't know if we should weight regularity the same as alertness or efficiency, or do these things contribute in ways that are more complex and that weigh more heavily on one dimension than another. Second, we have multiple health outcomes. So it seems unlikely that all sleep health dimensions are equally relevant to all health outcomes. So if, for instance, if you're trying to look at sleep health in relation to depression, are the same dimensions important as when you're looking at, say, cardiovascular disease as an outcome? And again, it would be incredible good fortune if all of the sleep health dimensions were equally important to all health outcomes. But I think that one of the useful things about this conceptualization is that if we do a good job of trying to assess multiple sleep health dimensions in all of our studies, then we would actually be able to address which health domains are most important and which are most important for which health outcomes. If we only if one study looks at duration, another study looks at satisfaction, another one looks at timing, we're never going to understand how the complex pattern of sleep contributes to health outcomes. All right, so again, I am not by any stretch of the imagination a statistician. So my summary of this is going to be pretty simplistic. There are a lot of words on this slide, but again, the ideas are not so complicated. So if we want to think about measuring a multidimensional entity, we can think about, first of all, just getting a composite score. That is doing the thing that I said probably wasn't going to work in every situation. Just add up the scores of each item on the RU-sated scale, for instance. So what's nice about this is that it's a very easy approach. But again, some of the weaknesses I have previously discussed. Another way of looking at this is to conduct factor analysis or principal components analysis that will tell us which specific sleep measures are related to each other and which ones are distinct from others. So this is a way, in short, of confirming whether the factors that we think are sensible conceptually actually exist when you measure people's sleep along multiple different dimensions. Yet another approach is cluster analysis or latent class analysis, which uses statistical techniques to identify groups of people who have similar characteristics. And what's useful about this is that you may derive empirically some phenotypes of sleep along these multiple dimensions that are specifically associated with health outcomes, either positive or negative. Now, again, cluster and factor analyses have some limitations as well, that the solutions can vary across samples and the factors or clusters are not necessarily easy to interpret. So again, there are some limitations as well as advantages. And finally, I'd like to just note that machine learning techniques could also be useful in this problem. The power of machine learning is that it makes very few assumptions of the data. So it uses computer algorithms to identify patterns in the data that might not be evident using other techniques. We can think of this really as a hypothesis generating technique, and it's one that's useful for very large data sets. So advantages and disadvantages to each of these. And now I'd like to just show you a couple of examples about how we might use these techniques to good advantage. So the first example is using this composite type of measure of multidimensional sleep health. My colleague Ryuji Furihata used this approach in an analysis of archival data from the study of osteoporotic fractures in older women. Dr. Furihata was interested in knowing whether multidimensional sleep health might relate to the concurrent presence of depression or the likelihood of developing depression longitudinally. And what he found is that by simply looking at the number of poor sleep health dimensions, there was in fact a relationship with concurrent depression, but as well, the number of abnormal dimensions was related to the likelihood of developing depression in a longitudinal study over the period of about 6 years. So again, this is a very simple technique. And it turns out that in this example, it was useful for identifying the risk of subsequent depression. Another example is from my colleagues led by Allison Harvey at UC Berkeley. They had a study of sleep health and various health risks in adolescent participants, and specifically 176 adolescents who are at risk for poor health outcomes. So again, the composite scores for these 6 sleep dimensions were basically added up. It was a little bit more complex, that they were actually kind of normed and added up. But what we can see is that the sleep health composite scores were significantly associated with subsequent outcomes relating to emotional and cognitive health and physical health, although not behavioral and social health. So again, the better the sleep health score, the lower the risk, the higher the score, the worse risk. So again, this multidimensional measure of sleep health, essentially just consisting of a composite of the sleep health dimensions, was related to these important outcomes in adolescence. An example of factor analysis from my colleague Meredith Wallace, who again used data from the study of osteoporotic fractures as well as the Mr. Oss study. So we had men and women. And in this study, Dr. Wallace was interested in whether or not the domains that we had proposed for multidimensional sleep health, were those domains actually observable in the actigraphy data of these older adults. And what she found was that very neatly, actually, that the factors that came out in each group and in both groups together were dimensions of timing, efficiency, duration, alertness or sleepiness, regularity, and again, satisfaction is not something that you can assess with actigraphy, but these other 5 dimensions were exactly the factors that were identified in this actigraphy factor analysis. What I have highlighted in bold here is the single measure from each category that had the highest factor loading. So again, we threw in, there were like, again, 28 actigraphy sleep measures. They nicely sorted into the categories that we had hypothesized. One other point I'd like to mention from this study is that ideally, again, you wouldn't want all of the dimensions to be measuring exactly the same thing, right? So we want them to hang together as sort of a single factor, but we don't want them to be super highly correlated with each other. And indeed, what Dr. Wallace showed and other people have shown with self-report measures of sleep health as well, is that the different dimensions are not very strongly related to each other. So for instance, regularity is not related to any of the other dimensions, nor is daytime alertness, sleepiness. And the correlations that are statistically significant are pretty small in magnitude. So all this suggests that it actually is useful to measure these different dimensions that probably no one dimension is going to tell us everything that we need to know about sleep. An example of cluster analyses. Again, I work with my colleague Meredith Wallace on these and other studies. This is an examination of self-reported phenotypes and mortality. Dr. Wallace subsequently has gone on to essentially replicate this analysis using actigraphy data. So the question was, if we measured multiple dimensions of sleep in these Mr. Oss and soft samples, could we identify ways in which these different measures clustered together within people? That is, could we identify groups of people with different sleep health characteristics? And indeed, when this latent class analysis was conducted, we identified 3 groups of people that we called a high sleep propensity group, an average sleep group, and a group that had insomnia with short sleep duration. So just to give you an example, for instance, the insomnia plus short sleep duration group was a group characterized by low sleep efficiency, poor sleep quality, and very short total sleep time, or TST. The high sleep propensity group was kind of interesting because they indeed did have long total sleep time, but they also had high sleepiness during the day. Their long total sleep time was apparently associated with a high general propensity for sleep. Now, again, it is kind of interesting to know that there are these phenotypes, but do they matter for anything? Well, in these data sets, we also had information on mortality. And what we found is that the sated phenotype indeed was a significant predictor of mortality. And that in particular, the high sleep propensity group seemed to have the highest risk of mortality. And there were indications that this group was somewhat higher as well, but not consistently statistically significant. So again, we can identify groups of people who have specific combinations of sleep health characteristics, and those combinations seem to matter in terms of health outcomes. Finally, one example using a machine learning technique called random survival forest. I won't begin to be able to explain that to you, but essentially it just empirically models these complex nonlinear interactions between different sleep measures and allows us to rank and quantify the importance of individual variables for some outcome. So again, using these techniques, Dr. Wallace was examining data from the Sleep Heart Health study and comparing the importance of sleep health to other standard health and demographic variables that may relate to mortality. And the outcomes showed that the self-report and polysomnographic sleep domains that we had in these groups actually were significant predictors of mortality with an importance that rivaled that of basic demographics such as age, sex, and race, and also various types of self-reported health measures. Again, when we did repeated internal validation, the sleep health measures remain significant predictors of mortality, even, perhaps not as strong as some of the traditional ones, but clearly significant and explaining a fair amount of the variation in mortality outcomes. So again, just the point of this section was to show you that we have different ways of analyzing multidimensional sleep health data, and that those analyses relate in important ways to health outcomes. So I'm not going to spend long on this at all. I just want to kind of flip through some very busy slides without referencing them, just to show you that there have been a number of studies looking at the relationship between sleep health and cross-sectional health outcomes, as well as longitudinal health outcomes, as well as things like healthcare costs. And in summary, what these studies are finding is that considering sleep from a multidimensional perspective relates to a variety of health outcomes, including depression, health risk factors in adolescence, the number of chronic disorders and self-rated health that a person has, their physical activity, cardiometabolic outcomes, cardiac outcomes, weight loss, mortality, and total healthcare costs. So again, it appears that considering multidimensional sleep health is useful in terms of providing an overall framework for understanding how it is that sleep is related to health outcomes. Now, the last thing I'd like to turn my attention to is, can we use this construct of multidimensional sleep health to conceptualize interventions for people that may improve their health outcomes? So again, if we start with our multidimensional sleep health framework, one can imagine that there are behavioral interventions that more or less target each of the 6 dimensions. Now, if you look carefully at these, and if you have some familiarity with behavioral sleep interventions, you'll know that some of these interventions are a little bit more solid than others. And I would suggest that really the 3 primary dimensions we can target behaviorally are the dimensions of regularity, timing, and duration. And by duration here, I'm really referring to the amount of time that a person spends in bed, because we can't directly control their sleep duration. But behaviorally, we can fairly easily target regularity, timing, and amount. My colleague, Allison Harvey at Berkeley, had begun to devise an intervention that was intended to be a transdiagnostic sleep intervention. Transdiagnostic really in 2 ways. One is that Dr. Harvey wanted to be able to target multiple types of sleep problems that a person might have. This contrasts with techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which of course targets insomnia, but might not have as much to say about people with other types of sleep problems. It's also multidimensional in the sense that Dr. Harvey was hoping that this intervention could be useful for people with various types of comorbidities, so that it wouldn't only be for people who have formally defined insomnia, it wouldn't only be for people with depression, that it might be adaptable to many different types of health contexts. So this intervention describes a number of cross-cutting modules, but I've highlighted the ones that are most relevant to our consideration of multidimensional sleep health. So one of the modules, the educational modules, is on sleep and circadian rhythms. Some of the core modules that patients are walked through include, again, establishing regular daytimes, sleep-wake times, and improving daytime function. but some of the most widely used optional modules include addressing sleep efficiency, which you really do by reducing time in bed, so that amount issue, and some techniques for dealing with delayed or advanced circadian rhythms. So this addresses that timing dimension in our sleep health framework. So this intervention, the transdiagnostic sleep and circadian intervention, has been tested. Dr. Harvey's first target for it was adults with serious mental illness, which again was a diverse set of people with diverse diagnoses ranging from schizophrenia to severe personality disorders to intractable depression. These were people in community mental health centers. And in the initial trial, participants were randomly allocated to TRAN-SC, or usual care, and the outcomes were as you see here. So what we found in this study is that according to outcomes such as the Sheehan Disability Scale or the DSM cross-cutting measure of symptoms, that the TRAN-SC intervention in red clearly had superior outcomes to the usual care condition, both immediately following treatment and 6 months later. As expected, there was also improvement in sleep disturbance and sleep-related impairment as measured by patient-reported outcomes. So this is a promising start for an intervention that is based on and draws on multidimensional sleep health frameworks and may be applied to different populations. In fact, some of my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh are conducting these sorts of adaptations to look at very different sorts of samples. So my colleagues Tina Goldstein, Adrian Soner, and Peter Franzen are looking at suicide and mood outcomes. Chris Imes is looking at sleep health and cardiovascular outcomes in adults with excess weight and poor sleep. And Katie Tai is looking at veterans with poor sleep who are in cardiac rehabilitation. Again, not all of whom will have insomnia, but many of whom have sleep complaints. So the very last part of intervention I'd like to talk about is casting a somewhat broader framework again. And the framework here is for us to remember that while sleep is important, it's part of a larger set of biological systems. And the biological system I'd like to focus on is that of the circadian timekeeping system. We all have biological clocks that run on a 24-hour cycle. And this is actually a biological adaptation to the fact that we live on this rapidly rotating planet that gives us regularly occurring cycles of light and dark. So the circadian timing system is our biological adaptation to that environmental reality of light and dark cycles. Because these environmental changes are so important biologically, the biological clock is actually instantiated in all of our cells, in the very genes within those cells. Now, there is a master pacemaker in the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus that kind of regulates the overall timing of our biological clocks. But it's important to keep in mind that every single cell in our body indeed has a biological clock. Those biological clocks regulate all of our brain functions and all of our body functions. And our brain and our body together result in physiology, behavior, and performance, including all of the important health behaviors that are known to be associated with better or worse health outcomes. So physical activity, eating, sleep, when we expose our eyes to light and darkness, all of these are both regulated by our biological clocks and in turn help to regulate those biological clocks. If we want optimal physiology, if we want optimal brain function, if we want optimal emotional function and cognitive function, then we need to be in sync with our 24-hour rhythms, and our 24-hour rhythms need to be in sync with the environmental light-dark cycle. So how might we use that knowledge to think about interventions that could help people achieve better health? Well, one way of thinking about it is this, that we have this circadian timing system that helps to regulate all of the key health behaviors I just mentioned. Those health behaviors have known effects on our physiology, and those aspects of our physiology relate to important health outcomes of all sorts. At each step of this process, our genes, environment, and social interactions are important moderators. I think the challenge for interventions is to ask whether we can use our knowledge of the circadian timing system to change our important health behaviors, acting through known physiologic mechanisms to optimize our health. Now, we certainly don't lack for interventions targeting, for instance, physical activity, or targeting eating behaviors, or targeting insomnia. But what we currently lack are interventions that are, if you will, upstream from those individual behaviors. If we pay attention to the fact that we have a biological clock that regulates all of these behaviors, could we focus our interventions here in order to affect multiple health behaviors? One way to think about this is that I mentioned that the main aspects of our sleep that are amenable to behavioral intervention are amount, regularity, and timing. But it turns out that each of those dimensions is equally important for these other health behaviors as well. So we can determine when we get light and dark exposure, how much light and dark exposure we get. We can control within reason when we eat, how much we eat, and whether that is regular, and the same for physical activity. So my colleagues and I have begun to think about trying to target multiple health behaviors by paying attention to these three main dimensions that are informed by the fact that we have these underlying biological clocks. So again, some examples. My colleague Sarah Stahl has an intervention called WELL that is focused on establishing regular routines of sleep, meals, and physical activity to address depression symptoms in spousally bereaved adults. Marquise Hawkins is looking at a combination of sleep and diet interventions that, again, derive from principles of the TRAN-SC and from the circadian perspective to influence postpartum weight loss and sleep disturbances. And my colleague Rachel Kulko-Conlon is again directly using this this clock framework to address the amount, regularity, and timing of key health behaviors to impact postpartum weight reduction and cardiometabolic health. We are not the only ones to have been on this track. So Ellen Frank has something called Health Rhythms, which is based on her earlier social rhythm therapy. Sachin Panda and colleagues have published this book about, focuses mostly on eating, but again, has a circadian framework. And Matt Buman and colleagues have developed an app to at least to track these behaviors that could be useful in interventions as well. Very last thing to mention is that all of these interventions that I'm talking about could be thought of at the individual level, but there are broader ways that we could implement them as well. So we can certainly think of individual sleep and circadian health interventions, but we could also think of intervening for specific demographic groups by adapting adaptations to best serve their needs. We could think of family and group-based interventions, as well as community and even societal interventions. If you think that this is totally pie in the sky, consider that there are many efforts that, successful efforts that have been undertaking to change school start times for adolescents in high school. Again, it's a public policy intervention that is based on our knowledge of the circadian timing system and multidimensional sleep health and what's ultimately best for our adolescents. So to summarize, I hope I've convinced you that we can define and measure sleep health. I've shown you some of the statistical approaches that we use, and that multidimensional sleep health relates to other important health outcomes. Finally, we are starting to develop behavioral interventions to improve sleep and circadian health outcomes and ultimately health. I think that we have started to gain some traction on this question of what is good sleep. And I know that I'm very grateful for that cab ride with Michael Tweary back in the day. I'd like to acknowledge my many colleagues who've contributed to these works, especially Meredith Wallace, who essentially conducted all of the analyses that I've shown you today. So thank you for your attention.
Dan, thank you for a great talk. A couple questions in the closing minutes. The first is related to application of the RU sated instrument or perhaps others for different clinical populations. So how might we interpret results differently, thinking about different psychiatric populations? One example, bipolar patients.
Yeah, I think there's two answers to that. One is that if the questionnaire does what we want it to do, it could be just a useful clinical guide. So it could prompt further assessment when a person scores high or low on one dimension versus another. So if a person does not have regular sleep timing, that immediately may become a focus for further questioning and potentially for intervention. The other thing, I guess I would say at a somewhat higher level is that we need to collect data in different populations so that we can just characterize and understand the differences between these populations that might allow us to be even more proactive in designing interventions. So for instance, if we found that patients with bipolar disorder have a particular profile on the RU sated questionnaire, is that the same profile as people with PTSD or other disorders? And might we have an idea about which types of intervention emphasis might be useful for which groups of people? But first we have to collect the data.
Well, in that regard, Dan, as you give this talk at, I assume at different institutions, are you soliciting investigators to insert their instruments in upcoming studies? And do you have a data deposit repository for that? Are
you volunteering?
To insert an instrument? Absolutely. To create a repository, no thanks.
Yeah, no, we don't. We actually don't have a single repository, but and yeah, anyone who's interested in this, I'm interested in talking with them and thinking of ways that we might collaborate. Our next step that we hope to get started with very soon, just in terms of basic validation work, is going to use online internet survey samples that are pretty well characterized. So that's a start, but we really do need to roll this out as well in clinical populations. And I wish that I were as organized as having, kind of a central repository. It's a great idea.
And last question, how are you using, and if so, how are you using the instrument in the Pitt Sleep Center itself?
We have not used it in our clinical population yet. We're waiting to get some validation data on the next version, and that's the one that we'd like to roll out in our clinical samples as well.
Well, Dan, thank you for a wonderful talk and for being with us today. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We are wrapping up. Thank you to the interpreters today. And please stay tuned for next year's schedule. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.